Imagine, for just a second, that you're holding a map.
Okay.
And it's not just any map, right? This piece of parchment promises to lead you directly to absolute paradise, like a perfect, flawless destination where all human suffering just ends.
Sounds pretty good, honestly.
Right. But as you're following it, hacking your way through the underbrush, you start to notice that the physical landscape it doesn't match what's drawn on the paper.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah. There is a sheer, impassable mountain, right where the map says there should be, like a fertile valley, or there's a raging, treacherous river where the ink shows this sturdy bridge.
Right, the data doesn't match the reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you turn to the person who's leading the expedition and you point out this discrepancy.
Yeah.
But their response isn't to, take out a pencil, observe the terrain, and update the map.
No, of course not.
No. The response is to declare that the mountain and the river are actually traitors to the expedition, and that you are an enemy of progress for even using your own eyes.
I mean, it is a profoundly terrifying scenario when you frame it like that.
It really is.
Because the moment the drawing on the paper becomes more sacred than the actual physical reality of the ground you're walking on, well, the expedition ceases to be about reaching a destination at all.
Right. It becomes about something else entirely.
Exactly. It morphs into a mechanism for enforcing a delusion. And as we know, enforcing a delusion against the physical laws of reality always requires force.
It requires violence, which is exactly what we are unpacking today. We are looking at the architecture of that exact kind of delusion.
Yes, we are.
We're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating, highly charged stack of material centered entirely around a book. It's titled The Death of Utopia, Karl Popper and the Fall of Maoist Ideology in the Philippines, and it's written by Dr. Jose Joel Maguiza Saikeiko.
It's a heavy text, but a really crucial one.
It is. Our mission here is to explore how the philosophy of Karl Popper, who was this 20th century thinker who basically dedicated his life to dismantling the intellectual blueprints of tyranny, how his work is utilized by the author to dissect the Communist Party of the Philippines, or the CPP, and its decades-long armed insurgency.
Right. But before we move another inch into this material, I think we really need to establish some operational ground rules for this discussion.
Oh, absolutely. Central.
Because, look, the text we are examining today deals with a highly politicized, real-world, and deeply bloody conflict.
Yeah.
It covers the left-wing insurgency led by the CPP, its armed wing, the NPA, and the political wing, the NDF. And, of course, it also covers the right-wing, state-backed military and political responses to it.
Right. And we need to be clear about our role here.
Exactly. Our directive is not to take any political sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of Dr. Egko, nor are we, condemning the specific individuals involved in the movement.
We are just the messenger.
Yes. Our job for you, the listener, is to impartially report, meticulously analyze, and just synthesize the arguments presented in this specific text. We're mapping out the intellectual history the author has laid down.
Just giving you the tools to understand the source material.
Yeah.
And the roadmap for this journey covers an immense amount of ground.
It really does.
We are starting in the cafes of mid-20th century Europe, examining the philosophical roots of totalitarianism. Then we're jumping straight into the jungles and urban undergrounds of the Philippines.
Which is quite the pivot.
It is. And we'll be investigating some explosive claims of ideological plagiarism within the revolution's founding texts.
The chapter is wild.
Yeah, and then we'll dissect the psychological anatomy of how, a modern college student gets radicalized through a smartphone screen today.
Right, the digital aspect.
And ultimately, we're going to explore how an anti-authoritarian philosopher's ideas about error correction connect directly to artificial intelligence, the tech industry, and the mathematical impossibility of sustaining a dictatorship.
It's a huge scope. But the fulcrum upon which this entire analysis balances is Karl Popper.
Yeah, we have to start with him.
To understand the Philippine conflict through the lens of this book, you first have to understand the specific philosophical framework Popper built in the shadow of World War II.
Because he lived through it.
He did. He was an Austrian-British philosopher who watched Europe literally tear itself to pieces under the weight of competing fascist and communist ideologies.
Just utter devastation.
Yeah. He observed these grand, sweeping promises of a perfect future ending inevitably in mass graves and industrialized slaughter. And he wrote his famous work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, to basically figure out why.
Which is so interesting because, when I hear the word totalitarianism, my mind immediately defaults to the aesthetic of military dictatorships, you know.
Like the 1930s and 40s.
Exactly. The marching troops, the censorship, the secret police. But Popper traces the intellectual rot way, way further back than that.
Well, centuries back.
Yeah. He essentially argues that the foundational blueprints for tyranny were drafted by the very people we celebrate as the founders of Western philosophy.
Right. He creates what you could almost call a lineage of intellectual authoritarianism, and he starts all the way back with Plato.
Plato. Which is crazy to think about.
It is. But Plato believed that society should be frozen in a state of rigid perfection, ruled by an elite class of philosopher kings who possessed absolute wisdom.
Meaning they could never be wrong.
Exactly. Any change to society was viewed by Plato as a degradation of that perfection. Then, Popper traces this lineage forward to Hegel.
Okay, and what was Hegel's contribution to this?
Hegel argued that the state is this almost divine, unstoppable force of destiny, right? And that it overrides the value of any single individual.
So the individual doesn't matter, only the collective destiny.
Precisely. And finally, Popper arrives at Karl Marx, who inherited Hegel's concept of unstoppable historical destiny, but he translated it into the language of economics and class warfare.
Predicting, like, a final, inevitable, utopian collapse of capitalism.
Yes. Which brings us to the core concept Popper despised more than anything else in the world: historicism.
Historicism. Let's define that for the listener, because it's central to the whole book.
It is. Historicism is the belief that human history isn't a messy, unpredictable series of choices made by free individuals.
Right.
Instead, historicism claims history is a script. It follows fixed, knowable scientific laws that lead to a preordained, perfect end state.
I mean, but hold on. If we put ourselves in the shoes of someone living in deep poverty or facing systemic injustice, isn't it incredibly comforting to think history has a direction?
Oh, highly comforting.
It's like being handed a GPS for human suffering.
Mm-hmm.
You're told, yes, things are terrible now, but history is fundamentally on our side. We just have to keep walking the path.
Right. It provides massive psychological armor.
Exactly.
It provides armor, yes, but it also strips away the humanity of everyone outside the movement. That comfort is precisely what Popper found so terrifying. Well, think about the logical conclusion of holding that GPS. If you are absolutely certain that your political movement is the sole vehicle for achieving a permanent, flawless utopia for all future generations,
Okay.
what is the mathematical value of one human life standing in your way? Or 10 lives? Or 10,000?
Wow. They just become a rounding error.
Exactly.
Because if the payoff is infinite perfection forever, then literally any finite amount of present-day violence can be justified as, like, an investment.
That is the exact trap of the closed society.
Yeah.
Popper conceptually divided the world into the closed society and the open society.
Okay, let's break those down.
The open society is built on a foundation of profound humility. It's a system that admits it can be, and often is, wrong.
It expects to make mistakes.
Yes. And because it assumes it will make mistakes, it builds in mechanisms for peaceful correction. Free speech, independent journalism, democratic elections to remove bad leaders without violence.
Right, you vote them out instead of shooting them.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But the closed society operates on the exact opposite premise. It claims to already possess the absolute final truth.
Because they have the historicist script.
Right. The party or the vanguard knows the script. Therefore, if you disagree with the party, you are not simply offering an alternative perspective.
You are attempting to derail human progress.
You're an obstacle to destiny itself. And the author of our source text, Dr. Edko, takes this entire European philosophical framework and drops it directly onto the CPP-NPA-NDF insurgency in the Philippines.
Which really changes how you look at the conflict.
It does. He frames it not merely as a military struggle over land reform or political power, but as a tragic, protracted philosophical error.
A prophecy that failed.
Yes. An insurgency driven by a prophecy that refused to die when its predictions failed to materialize. And therefore, it began demanding more and more human lives to justify the fact that the promised future never arrived.
And that failure of prediction brings us to the foundational blueprint of the Philippine movement. The book spends a massive amount of time in Chapter 4 dissecting a text called Philippine Society and Revolution, or PSR.
The ideological Bible of the movement.
Right. It was published in 1970 by Jose Maria de Sison, the founder of the CPP, writing under the alias Amado Guerrero. And like you said, it's treated as the undisputed holy text for the insurgency.
It is presented to every single recruit, as this brilliant, original, and deeply scientific diagnosis of the Philippine condition.
But the author introduces a pretty devastating accusation here.
Oh, it's explosive. Dr. Egpo, pulling extensively from the critiques of scholars like Armando Malay Jr. and testimonies of former high-ranking cadres, says the intellectual foundation of the revolution was heavily plagiarized.
And when the text says plagiarized, I mean, we're not just talking about a few uncredited quotes here.
No, not at all.
The author is suggesting a wholesale importation of a foreign template. He alleges Sison took Mao Zedong's writings from the late 1930s, and specifically a 1963 book by the Indonesian communist leader Dian Adit.
Yes, Adit's book was titled MRI, which stands for Indonesian Society and the Indonesian Revolution.
Right, and the source material actually contains a side-by-side comparison, doesn't it?
It does. It compares the table of contents and the structural progression of Adit's book right next to Sison's PSR.
Wow.
And the critics, highlighted by the author, argue that Sison essentially lifted the progression of revolutionary tasks, the identification of class enemies, and the core structural contradictions directly from the Indonesian text.
So he just transposed a foreign revolutionary template and swapped the Indonesian historical references out for Philippine ones.
That is the argument, yes.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate for a second because I know some historians like Joseph Scalis, for example, have defended Sison on this specific point.
Right, the Marxist-Leninist-Maoist tradition argument.
Exactly. They argue that within that specific ideological tradition, you aren't actually expected to invent entirely new theories. You are supposed to apply the established universal truths of the ideology to your local conditions.
So it's not theft, it's application.
Yeah, to a defender, it's just operating within an ideological lineage.
The author acknowledges that defense in the text, but he dismisses it as a distinction without a difference when we look at the real-world consequences.
How so?
Because the problem with copy-pasting an ideological template isn't just about academic integrity. The real problem is that a template freezes your perception of reality. Because Sison was trying to fit the Philippines into Mao's specific blueprint for a protracted people's war, he had to declare the Philippines a semi-colonial and semi-feudal society.
And that phrase, semi-colonial and semi-feudal, I mean, that is the load-bearing pillar of the entire movement.
It holds the whole thing up.
It dictates that the Philippines is primarily this agrarian, peasant-driven society controlled by foreign imperialists and local landlords. It is the absolute justification for why the revolution must start in the countryside and slowly encircle the cities.
Exactly. Which brings us back to Popper and the ultimate test of any theory. Popper argued that a theory is only valid if it can be falsified.
Falsified, meaning you have to be able to test it against reality and adjust it when it's wrong.
Right. But Sison's diagnosis was locked in place in 1970.
I do have to push back here, though, just thinking about the context. If we look at the Philippines in the 1970s, and honestly, even vast stretches of the countryside today, extreme poverty is a harsh daily reality.
Undoubtedly.
You have massive land inequalities, you have dynastic political families controlling entire provinces, and deep agricultural struggles. So isn't it possible that the semi-feudal diagnosis, even if it was borrowed, was actually somewhat accurate at the time?
That is an incredibly persuasive point, and frankly, it explains exactly why the movement gained such massive traction in its early years.
Right, the suffering was made up.
The grievances were absolutely authentic. The suffering of the peasantry was undeniably real. But the author's critique, and this is where he relies on economic data over the subsequent decades, is that while the grievances were real, the structural diagnosis of the entire economy was fundamentally flawed.
And it became increasingly absurd as time passed.
Exactly. Because the economy didn't stay frozen in 1970.
Right. Reality kept moving.
Far from it. The text points out economic phenomena that neither Marx nor Mao ever predicted, and which the CPP's static ideology completely failed to account for.
Like what?
Well, by the 1990s and 2000s, the Philippines saw the massive explosion of overseas Filipino workers, or OFWs.
Oh, wow. Yes. Millions of people.
Millions of Filipinos went abroad, sending back billions of dollars in remittances, and that money bypassed the traditional landlord-tenant dynamic entirely.
It built houses, funded college tuitions.
Exactly. It fundamentally altered the class structure in the provinces. And then you add the rise of the business process outsourcing sector, the BPO industry.
Right, the call centers and tech hubs.
Suddenly, you have millions of young Filipinos working in massive urban centers, engaging in the global digital economy, creating this massive consumption-driven middle class.
So the reality of the modern Philippines simply does not resemble an isolated agrarian society ripe for a peasant-led uprising.
Not at all. But here's the tragedy of the closed system. If you are operating a medical clinic and you diagnose a patient with a broken leg, but an X-ray shows it's actually a severe bacterial infection, you change the treatment.
Because if you put a cast on a severe infection, the patient dies.
Precisely. The CPP, according to this text, looked at the X-ray showing the rise of the OFW phenomenon and the urban middle class, and instead of changing the diagnosis, they declared the X-ray a bourgeois illusion.
They just rejected the data.
They cannot admit the 1970 doctrine is wrong because admitting error shatters the illusion of infallibility, so the doctrine ignores reality.
The growing middle class is just dismissed as a temporary anomaly.
Or worse, as class traders who have been bribed by capitalism.
The author actually captures this rigid, mismatched ideology with a really brilliant and honestly slightly absurd metaphor.
Oh, I love this part.
He calls it chop suey Sissonism.
It is a very vivid way to describe ideological incoherence.
It really is. He basically paints Sisson as this reckless chef in the kitchen of history. He takes a massive chunk of classic Marxism, which, by the way, is an ideology that had already failed its core prophecy because the industrialized working class in Europe never inevitably revolted as Marx predicted.
Right, strike one.
Then Sisson tosses in a heavy dose of Leninism, which structurally failed to ever hand power back to the people, creating deeply entrenched authoritarian states instead.
Check two.
Finally, he spices it up with Mao's strategy of guerrilla warfare from the countryside. He throws all these globally failed, disparate ingredients into a single pot, turns up the heat, and just forces it onto the Philippine landscape.
And the author's point with the chop suey metaphor is to highlight what happens when the recipe inevitably fails.
No.
In a normal kitchen, if the stew you made gives everyone food poisoning, the chef throws out the recipe and starts over.
They admit the mistake.
But in the kitchen of chop suey Sissonism, the chef is infallible. If the revolution doesn't succeed, you don't blame the imported, mismatched ingredients.
You blame the people who are refusing to eat it.
Exactly. You declare that the masses are suffering from false consciousness and that they need to be forced to consume the ideology for their own good.
So if the economic diagnosis is completely detached from reality, and the philosophical recipe is a proven disaster globally, how does the organization survive the contradiction for over half a century?
That is the crucial question. And the answer the author provides is that they build an impenetrable wall around the minds of their members.
Which takes us directly into the architecture of the 2016 CPP Constitution and Program.
Right. Dr. Egko dedicates a significant portion of the book to reading this specific document through the Popperian lens. He doesn't treat it as a standard political manifesto.
What does he treat it as?
He treats it as a structural architecture of error. He points out that from the very first page, the document assumes that historical certainty we discussed earlier, and more importantly, it establishes the absolute primacy of the vanguard party.
There's a specific organizational principle mentioned in the text that sounds incredibly benign to an outsider. It's called democratic centralism.
Oh, yes.
Because if you just hear the words, it sounds like a healthy compromise, right? Democratic implies everyone gets a vote, and centralism implies we move together efficiently as a unified body.
It sounds great on paper.
But the text unpacks this as something much darker.
The author dismantles the illusion entirely. He defines its actual on-the-ground execution as debate now, obey forever.
Obey forever. It's essentially like being on a jury.
Okay, how so?
Well, in a normal democratic system, you can vote on a law, lose, and then spend the next 4 years publicly campaigning about why that law is terrible and needs to be repealed.
Right, you can keep dissenting.
It's exactly. But under democratic centralism, it's like the deliberation room of a murder trial. You can argue furiously with the other jurors behind closed doors. But the second the foreman reads the verdict to the judge, the debate ceases to exist.
That's a great analogy.
If you walk out to the press on the courthouse steps and say, I still think we got the verdict wrong.
Yeah.
You don't just get kicked off the jury. You are treated as an accessory to the crime.
That perfectly captures the psychological trap. Within the party structure, lower organs might be permitted to discuss the tactical execution of a directive. But the fundamental party line, the overarching strategy dictated by the Central Committee, is sacred.
Untouchable.
Once a decision is handed down from the top, questioning its validity is strictly forbidden. The text highlights how the Constitution actually criminalizes independent thought.
It literally makes it a crime.
Yes. The party designates itself as the highest and purest expression of the working class. Therefore, by definition, the party cannot be wrong.
So if a member disagrees with the Central Committee,
That member is not holding a different opinion. They are, according to the doctrine, suffering from bourgeois deviationism.
wow. And this is the exact mechanism of the closed society that Popper warned about, isn't it?
It is. When an ideology seals every possible window against criticism, it creates a pressure cooker. Think about it. If the theory dictates that the revolution is historically inevitable, and yet decade after decade, the revolution is fundamentally failing to capture state power.
The system can't process that failure logically.
No, it cannot say, perhaps our reading of the Philippine class structure in 1970 was flawed.
Because if the map is perfect, then the failure to reach the destination must be.
Must be the fault of saboteurs in the expedition.
God, that's chilling.
Exactly the dynamic. The ideology must invent enemies to explain its own empirical failures. And this leads to the darkest and most tragic chapters of the book, where the author details the human cost of this architecture of error.
The purges.
Yes. He focuses heavily on the internal purges that ravaged the movement, most notably Kampanyang Ahos in Mindanao during the 1980s.
The sheer scale of the paranoia described in the text is staggering. Thousands of dedicated cadres people who had literally given up their families and their futures for the revolution were suddenly accused of being deep penetration agents or military spies.
By their own comrades.
Right. The author details how hundreds of them were tortured into false confessions and executed not by the government military, but by their own side.
And Dr. Echo uses Popper to make a chilling, vital point here. These internal killings were not an aberration.
They weren't just a mistake.
No. They were not just a regrettable mistake made by a few overzealous local commanders who lost their way. The violence, the paranoia, the spy tagging, these are structural requirements of a closed society.
Because they have to discharge the pressure of failure.
Exactly. When an organization is mathematically incapable of admitting an error, the only way to explain failure is to find a scapegoat. The purges were simply the ideological immune system attacking its own body to protect the prophecy.
The author actually quotes former cadres who survived this era. They testified that people were flagged for execution simply for raising logistical questions or, suggesting that a military offensive was ill-timed.
Just for asking a question.
Right. And in a Popperian open society, questioning leadership is the highest civic duty. It's how you fix potholes and prevent bad wars. But in this closed system, asking, what if we are taking the wrong approach, was interpreted as an act of treason.
It's fatal.
The text contains this really powerful assertion. Freedom does not begin with a gun. Freedom begins with a question. And in the CPP-NPA-NDF, the question is exactly, what must die first?
That is a very heavy quote. And understanding that internal reality forces us to ask a really difficult question.
Which is?
If the environment inside the movement is this rigid, this paranoid, and this dangerous, how do they continue to replenish their ranks?
That is the million-dollar question.
How does a movement stuck in a 1970s ideological framework continue to pull in idealistic young people today?
The author answers this by detailing the modern mechanics of radicalization, which he calls the newsfeed wars.
Ah, right. The digital front.
He argues that while the physical battles might still happen in remote provinces, the actual front line of recruitment has migrated entirely to the smartphone screen.
And he breaks down the recruitment playbook, right? This deeply psychological pipeline.
Yes, it's known as the AOM scheme. Arouse, organize, mobilize. Let's walk through how this actually operates in practice, because the text makes it clear that the groomers do not approach a college freshman and hand them a dense copy of Marx's Das Kapital.
Right, that would scare them off immediately.
Exactly. They don't lead with armed struggle, they lead with extreme empathy. They start with a simple, validating question. Kamusta ka? How are you?
The arouse phase.
Yeah. It's entirely about hijacking genuine, valid frustrations. Let's say you are a university student. You're scrolling through your feed and you see a viral video of a politician engaging in blatant corruption. Or you read a report about farmers being displaced from their ancestral land.
You feel a deep, righteous anger.
And that anger is a perfectly healthy democratic response. But a recruiter identifies that anger, validates it, and amplifies it. They tell you, you are right to be furious. The system is completely broken.
And then comes the organize phase.
Right. They invite you into a community. It might be a legal campus organization, a study group, or a specialized chat server.
And suddenly, you are surrounded by incredibly passionate, articulate people who share your exact outrage.
They give you a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose that is just intoxicating for a young adult trying to find their place in the world.
But inside that organized space, the ideological funnel begins to narrow.
Slowly but surely.
The community slowly begins to isolate the recruit from alternative perspectives. They start framing moderate voices, reformists, or anyone who suggests peaceful legislative solutions as elaborators or enablers of the corrupt system.
Which isolates you further. And finally, you hit the mobilize phase.
Right. Once the recruit's entire social ecosystem is dependent on this new group, the core dogma is introduced. The system cannot be reformed. Elections are a sham.
The only solution is destruction.
Yes. The only scientific, historically validated solution is the complete destruction of the state via armed struggle. You entered a funnel angry about a specific corrupt politician, and you exit the funnel convinced you need to go to the mountains and learn how to assemble a rifle.
It's terrifyingly effective. And to explain the psychology of the person who reaches the end of that funnel, the author integrates the philosophy of Eric Hoffer.
Specifically his landmark book, The True Believer.
Right. If Karl Popper explains the logical and structural flaws of the ideology, Eric Hoffer explains how that ideology psychologically captures and consumes an individual human being.
Hoffer's theory is just fascinating. He argued that mass fanatic movements don't appeal to people who are successfully advancing their own individual lives.
Who do they appeal to?
They appeal to people who are deeply frustrated, people who feel powerless, and crucially, people who want to be rid of the burden of their own individual identity.
So it's a process of psychological self-renunciation.
Exactly. Hoffer observed that the true believer views their own individual life as spoiled, insignificant, or hopelessly compromised.
So the movement offers them a bargain.
Surrender your individual identity, your personal dreams, your family ties, your independent critical thought, and in exchange, we will fuse you into a collective mass that is destined to change the world.
It is a profound psychological substitution. You trade the messy, difficult task of building your own life for like a premium subscription to History Inc.
History Inc., that's good.
The author points out that you trade your name, your family, and your moral autonomy for a promise called destiny. And in this new state of being, your only metric of value is your absolute, unquestioning obedience to the collective will.
And the text underscores this psychological capture with some really heartbreaking testimonies from those who managed to break the conditioning and escape.
There is a particularly striking case study involving a farmer in a remote barangay.
Right. Yes, the story of the road. This farmer was a supporter of the movement, but one day the local government finally built a concrete road connecting his village to the main market town.
And the farmer was thrilled.
Naturally. He could sell his crops easier, his kids could get to school without wading through mud. It was a tangible improvement.
But the local cadre visited him and severely reprimanded him.
Yes. The cadre accused the farmer of suffering from false consciousness. He was told that being happy about the road meant he was being bribed by the reactionary state and that true liberation would only come after the entire system was overthrown.
And the farmer's response is just the ultimate refutation of the ideology.
It really is. He realized he didn't care about the historical timeline of a Marxist utopia. He just wanted a better life for his children in the present tense.
He wanted the road.
Exactly. Another testimony features a couple who spent years in the underground, only to surrender because they realized that staying meant their children would be forced to inherit the exact same war.
They wanted their children to have the freedom to choose their own futures.
To make their own mistakes rather than being conscripted into a 50-year-old script.
Which proves Popper's fundamental thesis on a deeply human, emotional level. The desire for a guaranteed utopia is strong, but eventually the human soul craves the freedom to think, the freedom to observe reality, and the freedom to pursue individual happiness over the suffocating demand to blindly obey a vanguard.
And that realization that individuals inherently crave the ability to observe and adapt leads to what is arguably the most surprising and intellectually thrilling pivot in the entire book.
Oh man, chapter 16.
Yes. Dr. Etko takes Popper's philosophy ideas forged in the 1940s to combat fascism and communism and applies them directly to the modern tech industry, Silicon Valley, and artificial intelligence.
When I first saw that chapter title in the outline, I'll be honest, it felt like a massive leap.
It sounds like it shouldn't work.
Right. How do we get from the jungles of the Philippines and the writings of Plato to the algorithms running on the smartphone in my pocket?
But the author bridges that gap beautifully by returning to the core engine of Popper's philosophy, the principle of falsification.
Let's remind the listener how that works in this context.
Popper argued that for any theory to be considered genuinely scientific, it must be falsifiable, meaning there must be a way to test it against physical reality and prove it wrong.
So if a theory cannot be proven wrong,
Like the historicists claim that communism is an inevitable destiny, which just excuses away any failure as a temporary setback. And it isn't science. It is pseudoscience. It's religion.
okay.
The author argues that this exact principle of relentless, verifiable falsification is the bedrock foundation of all modern computing and software engineering.
He actually illustrates this by contrasting two different rooms and two different reactions to failure.
The communist cell versus the tech startup.
Exactly. Imagine you are sitting in a clandestine communist cell meeting. A young, observant activist raises their hand and points at a glaring contradiction.
Oh, boy.
They say, "Comrades, we've been predicting the imminent collapse of the ruling class for 50 years, but the economy is growing, and the working class seems more interested in buying smartphones than launching an armed revolt. Is it possible? Our theory is flawed."
And in a closed society, that question is lethal. The instructor shuts them down immediately, shames them in front of the group, and warns them about bourgeois infiltration.
Because admitting an error threatens the entire structural integrity of the prophecy.
Right. Now contrast that with a room in a tech startup. A junior programmer is running a test on a new app they're about to launch.
Okay.
The app completely freezes and crashes the server. The programmer yells out across the room, "Hey, the code is totally broken. The architecture failed."
And what is the reaction in that room?
The team doesn't encourage the programmer. They celebrate. They gather around the screen because they found a bug.
Identifying the error is the necessary prerequisite to fixing it.
Exactly. You update the code, and you push a superior version of the software.
The author coins a really beautiful phrase for this. He calls it the Mali Ako principle.
Mali Ako.
Right, which is Tagalog for "I am wrong." In the tech world, discovering that you are wrong is not a failure. It is the fundamental fuel for progress.
The author humorously notes that modern software debugging is essentially Popperian philosophy running on caffeine and dark mode.
Which is such a great line. But think about the implications of that. The entire digital revolution, the fact that computing power has grown exponentially for decades, is the result of systems that actively institutionalize error correction.
The tech industry doesn't assume its first draft is a sacred, infallible text.
It assumes the first draft is full of flaws that need to be aggressively hunted down and replaced.
And the author takes this even further by diving into the mechanics of artificial intelligence and machine learning. The way modern neural networks learn is the ultimate vindication of Karl Popper.
Let's talk about backpropagation.
Yes. Consider how a machine learning model is trained using backpropagation. You don't program an AI by handing it a static set of rigid rules and declaring it perfect.
No.
You give it a task, say, identifying a picture of a cat. The AI makes a blind guess, and it gets it wrong.
It's like stepping into a shower with a wildly unpredictable temperature dial. You turn the knob slightly, and the water is scalding hot. That's an error.
All right.
You don't stand there and pretend the water is comfortable because your theory said it should be. You rapidly turn the dial the other way. Now it's freezing cold, another error.
You adjust again?
You nudge it back, correcting the previous error based on the feedback from reality until you find the perfect temperature.
That is exactly how backpropagation works. The AI makes a guess. The system feeds the error rate back into the network. The model adjusts the mathematical weights of its connections to reduce that error, and it guesses again.
Repeating the cycle millions of times.
Yes. AI requires the existence of error in order to learn. It maps reality through a massive, high-speed Popperian feedback loop.
And the text highlights a devastating irony here. The digital world is evolving at lightning speed, fundamentally reshaping human existence, curing diseases, and connecting the globe, precisely because it institutionalizes humility.
It operates on the assumption that it must constantly correct its own mistakes.
Meanwhile, the Maoist insurgency is stuck in the jungle, repeating the exact same slogans from 1968 because its core ideological operating system forbids it from ever uttering the words Mali Ako.
A system designed to learn from reality will mathematically always outcompete a system designed to command reality, Which brings us to the core moral argument that the author uses to synthesize the entire book.
The grand finale.
Yes, it is the contrast between the CPP's reliance on utopian engineering and Popper's fierce advocacy for piecemeal social engineering.
Let's define those terms clearly, because they represent two fundamentally incompatible ways of viewing human progress.
Let's start with utopian engineering.
That is the revolutionary mindset. It operates on the belief that society is entirely rotten, and the only way to build a perfect future is to burn the existing structures to the ground.
You have to destroy the entire canvas before you can paint your masterpiece.
Exactly. Whereas piecemeal social engineering is the democratic reformist approach.
It acknowledges that society is flawed, often deeply unfair, and plagued by suffering. But instead of burning down the house, you identify a specific, isolated problem.
Like a lack of maternal health care in a specific rural province.
Right. You gather data, you build a clinic, you test different administrative approaches. If the clinic fails to lower mortality rates, you acknowledge the error, you reform the administration, and you try a new approach.
It's the difference between trying to fix society with bricks versus trying to fix it with bullets.
That's a great way to put it, bricks versus bullets.
And the text makes a crucial, necessary clarification here. There is a risk that criticizing a revolutionary movement can sound like an endorsement of the status quo.
Like you're saying, everything is fine as it is.
Right, but the author explicitly states that Popper was not against activism. In fact, Popper viewed robust, noisy activism as the lifeblood of an open society.
Peaceful dissent, investigative journalism exposing corruption, street protests demanding better wages, intense Senate inquiries. The author refers to all of these as the check engine lights on the dashboard of a democracy.
They are the vital feedback mechanisms that alert the society to its own errors. Without them, the engine seizes up.
Exactly. Popperian activism is public criticism in action. It is how we falsify bad government policies.
So what did Popper oppose then?
What Popper opposed, and what Dr. Egko vehemently argues against throughout this book, is activism that acts merely as a conveyor belt to violence.
Yeah.
He attacks the kind of activism that is used cynically as a recruitment funnel for a historicist prophecy that justifies murder.
The author draws a sharp, unforgiving line there. Organizing a protest to demand transparency in a government infrastructure project is a profoundly Popperian act.
Yes.
But manipulating the anger of a young student, isolating them from their family, and funneling them into the mountains to shoot underpaid soldiers in service of a 50-year-old static dogma that is the definition of totalitarianism.
As the book reaches its conclusion, the author delivers what I consider the most profound moral verdict of the entire text. He writes, "Death is certain, history is not."
Death is certain, history is not. Wow.
It is a devastatingly simple summation. Because human beings cannot predict the future with absolute certainty, because history is not a fixed script waiting to be performed. No political movement possesses the authority to demand human sacrifice.
You cannot guarantee the utopia you are promising.
Therefore, you have no right to collect the blood of others as a down payment.
No vision of a perfect society, no matter how exquisitely it is detailed on a piece of paper, has the right to demand a single human life as the cost of admission.
When you absorb that argument, you realize that a democracy, even a messy, noisy, gridlocked, corrupt, and deeply flawed democracy, is fundamentally, structurally more humane than any closed utopian system.
Because a democracy, by its very nature, allows itself to be criticized. It allows you to change the people in power without having to fire a single shot.
A system that solves its internal disagreements by shooting its critics can never, by definition, lead to human liberation.
It is a defense of the open society, not because it has achieved perfection, but precisely because it embraces its own imperfection.
And Dr. Egko uses his own life trajectory to embody this intellectual journey. He went from a radicalized youth navigating the jungles of Bataan, fully captured by the true believer mindset, to a government official actively defending democratic institutions.
A transition from the deadly certainty of historicism to the life-affirming humility of Popperian error correction.
We have covered an immense expanse of territory today.
We really have. We started with Karl Popper fleeing the totalitarian shadows of Europe, analyzed how Jose Maria Sison copy-pasted a foreign ideology to misdiagnose the Philippine economy, examined the tragic, bloody internal purges required to maintain that illusion, and finally tracked how the self-correcting algorithms of Silicon Valley proved the superiority of an open system.
It is a sweeping, urgent narrative about the lethal danger of dogma and the immense progressive power of simply being able to say, I might be wrong.
If there's one ultimate takeaway to pull from this extensive deep dive into Dr. Egko's text, it is the realization that embracing our own fallibility is not a weakness.
Not at all. Admitting error is the ultimate impenetrable defense against extremism. It is a core engine of all human progress, both scientifically and morally.
The exact moment a leader, a party, or a movement claims to have all the absolute answers is the exact moment they stop learning and start coercing.
That is exactly right.
And that framework leaves me with a final provocative thought to consider. We spent time discussing how the digital age, the global internet, and artificial intelligence are all fundamentally built on open feedback loops, rapid error correction, and the Maliaco principle.
Right.
If the underlying operating system of the modern world is mathematically dependent on falsification, will closed, dogmatic societies eventually become technologically impossible to sustain.
Oh, that's a fascinating thought.
If the very fabric of our future relies on Popperian code, are we literally, mathematically, coding totalitarianism out of existence? Are the mapmakers who refuse to look at the landscape doomed to just get left behind by the GPS of human progress?
It is a phenomenal question, and how the architecture of information evolves over the next few decades will undoubtedly provide the answer.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the material. Keep testing the maps you are handed, keep demanding the freedom to ask questions, and above all, keep your minds open. We'll catch you next time.